During two world wars, one crop became the difference between survival and starvation across the highlands of Anatolia. Governments mandated it. Farmers staked everything on it. It fed soldiers, fed their families, and kept entire communities alive through winters that had no right to be survived. It asked for almost nothing and gave back more than any other crop available. And then it started destroying the very soil that had grown it. Not through drought, not through disease, at least not at first. Through something far more ordinary and far more insidious. Through the completely rational decisions of exhausted, desperate farmers doing exactly what the situation demanded of them. This is the story of how the potato saved Anatolian farming and what that salvation quietly cost. If you enjoy forgotten stories hidden beneath everyday things, subscribe and join us as we uncover them. Before the wars, the Anatolian highlands farmed the way they had for centuries. Not out of stubbornness, out of accumulated wisdom. A typical smallholder in those years worked a mix of crops that most modern farmers would find almost quaint. Wheat on the main terraces, lentils along the lower edges where the soil held more moisture, chickpeas on the dry upper slopes where nothing else would cooperate, onions near the house, a few fruit trees along the boundary walls doing double duty as windbreak and harvest. The fields were not large. The tools were not modern. Wooden plows, hand sickles, threshing floors beaten flat by animal hooves. By any industrial standard, the system was inefficient. But it worked. Not despite its diversity, because of it. Legumes quietly fixed nitrogen into soil that the grain had been stripping out. Deep-rooted plants broke up the compaction left by years of cereal cropping. Root vegetables created channels in the clay. Every crop in the rotation was unknowingly doing maintenance work on the crops that would follow it. The farmers did not have the scientific language for any of this. They did not need it. What they had was something harder to acquire and easier to lose. The accumulated knowledge of people who had worked the same ground across enough generations to have felt every mistake it is possible to make. The potato had been part of this world for over 100 years by the time the 20th century opened. It had never become the dominant crop it was in Ireland or across Eastern Europe. Here it filled gaps, reliable, unpretentious, useful for the thin months between harvests. A crop you depended on without thinking too hard about it. Nobody, in those quiet years before everything changed, would have looked at a potato field and seen a weapon. Nobody would have looked at it and seen a warning either. Both were coming. The first thing any war takes is the men. You feel the absence before you understand it. A village that woke up to 40 pairs of hands in the field is suddenly working with 12. The strongest backs, the fastest movers, gone. Called up, conscripted, handed a rifle and a direction, and told to march. Letters came home for a while. Then sometimes the letters stopped. In the broader European story, the First World War is mostly a conflict of trenches in France. In Anatolia, it arrived differently, more intimate, more total. The Ottoman Empire was at the center of the conflict, which meant the conflict was everywhere. Conscription notices on the walls of village mosques, requisitioning officers arriving to take the grain stores, the livestock, sometimes the farm tools, because the army needed feeding before the village did. Roads clogged with troops moving one direction, refugees moving another, while the fields sat half-worked and waiting. Women took over. Elderly fathers took over. Children who should have been in school found themselves doing the work of grown men before they were old enough to understand why. This is not a softened detail from a history book. It is what actually happened on actual farms, in actual Anatolian villages, across both the First and the Second World War. The women bent their backs over the same soil their husbands had worked, and they made it function, because no one was offering an alternative. But labor shortage was only part of the problem. The deeper damage was happening underground, invisibly, in the soil itself. The careful rotation that had maintained soil health across generations required time, attention, and the luxury of planting for the long term. None of those things existed in a war. You plant what feeds the most people the fastest. You plant what survives with the least attention. You plant what requires the fewest inputs when there are no inputs to be had. So the interlocking system began to collapse. The wheat and the lentils and the chickpeas, all working together in quiet cooperation, gave way to a simpler, more urgent logic. And that logic pointed directly at the potato. Here is what made the potato so extraordinary in conditions like these. It grows in poor soil, not just tolerates it, genuinely thrives where other staple crops produce pale, thin harvests. The Anatolian highlands presented exactly the kind of challenge the potato was built for. Acidic soils, clay-heavy ground, short growing windows at altitude, temperature swings extreme enough to stress most cultivars. The potato handled all of it without complaint. Then consider the caloric yield. Agricultural data from the period confirms what farmers were already observing in their fields. A single hectare of potatoes, managed by one person with basic tools and no chemical inputs, produced more calories than the same hectare of wheat by a significant margin. Not marginally more, substantially more. The potato is roughly 80% water, but the remaining 20% is dense with carbohydrates, vitamin C, potassium, and B vitamins. The precise combination needed to prevent deficiency diseases when everything else in the diet had been reduced to near nothing. Military planners across Europe had understood this since at least the Napoleonic campaigns. A soldier fed on potatoes is a soldier who keeps marching. By the second and third year of the First World War, governments were not just allowing potato cultivation, they were mandating it. In Germany, the potato had already become the cornerstone of the wartime food strategy. Regional administrators across the collapsing Ottoman territories pushed the same logic onto Anatolian farmers, who, in most cases, needed very little persuasion. They could see what the potato was doing for their families. And storage. A harvested potato kept in a cool, dark place, a cellar, a stone-lined pit, a cave, survives through winter without refrigeration, without processing, without anything more sophisticated than darkness and dry straw. In a context where supply chains had broken down and nothing could be reliably transported between regions, that was not a convenience. It was a lifeline. The exhausted, short-handed Anatolian farmer looked at the potato and saw something he desperately needed to see. He saw a way through. The trouble with a lifeline is that you hold it too tight. That is not a failure of intelligence. It is what survival does to a person. When something genuinely saves you, keeps your children fed through a winter that would have broken you otherwise, you do not diversify away from it the following spring. You plant more of it. You give it your best fields. You tell your neighbors what it did for you, and they plant more too. And slowly, without anyone making a deliberate choice, the thing that saved you becomes the only thing. This is what happened across Anatolian farmland during the war years. Not through ignorance, through the completely rational logic of desperate people making the best decisions available. Season after season, field after field, the rotations that had maintained soil health across generations disappeared, replaced by the same crop in the same ground year after year. The first sign was the yield. A farmer growing potatoes in the same field for 3 consecutive seasons would notice by the third year that something had shifted. The plants came up and looked reasonable from a distance, but at harvest, the tubers were smaller. More had gone soft before they could be dug. The flavor changed in a way that was hard to articulate, but unmistakable to anyone who had eaten potatoes from the same ground for years. The land was tired. It had been asked to give the same thing too many times without being given anything in return. If this story has surprised you so far, let us know in the comments whether you think you would have made the same decisions these farmers did. Because honestly, most of us would have. The biological reality of monoculture is not complicated, though its consequences are. Soil is not a growing medium. It is a living system, populated by bacteria, fungi, earthworms, and thousands of other organisms that maintain fertility through the exchange that happens when different plants grow in sequence. Remove that succession, replace it with a single crop, and the system begins to unravel. Not immediately, gradually, building up a deficit that eventually has to be paid. For continuous potato cultivation, that reckoning arrived in two forms. The first was structural. Years of monoculture reduced the organic matter that gives healthy soil its dark color and its ability to retain water. Without it, rain ran off instead of soaking in. The surface crusted over. What had once been resilient, moisture-holding ground became shallow and fragile, cracking in summer heat and turning gray in autumn rain. The second was more frightening. It had a name: Phytophthora infestans. The water mold, responsible for potato late blight, does not need much encouragement. It needs moisture, moderate temperatures, and a host. A field planted with potatoes year after year provides exactly that. The pathogen builds up in the soil and in the plant material left behind after harvest. Each new crop arrives into ground that is already carrying the disease. By midsummer, under the right conditions, a field that looked healthy in June could be black and rotting by August. The Anatolian farmer had seen blight before. It was not new. But historical accounts from the period describe a crucial distinction that many farmers learned only after it was too late. In a diversified farm, a blight outbreak is devastating, but survivable. The wheat and the lentils are still standing. In a field where potatoes are the only thing growing, there is nothing left to fall back on. One was a setback, the other was a catastrophe. And blight was not alone. Nematodes, microscopic worms that attack potato root systems, accumulate in soil continuously planted with the same crop. Scab, caused by a soil-borne bacterium, worsened season by season. Wireworm populations grew. The entire underground world that the farmer could not see was becoming increasingly hostile to the one crop he was now entirely dependent upon. The land had been warning them for seasons. Not everyone heard it in time. The wars ended. The men who came home were changed. So were the fields they returned to. Agricultural reports from the post-war period describe a particular quality to the affected farmland. Topsoil that had thinned visibly, soil that cracked in summer and turned paste-like in autumn rain. Harvests that came in pale and light no matter how carefully the season was managed. The earthworm populations that are essential to soil health had collapsed in continuously cropped fields. The fungal networks that connect plant roots and help them access nutrients had been disrupted. The bacterial communities responsible for cycling nutrients back into plant-available forms were diminished. None of it was visible to the eye, but every farmer could feel it in the weight of the harvest. Here is the unexpected part of this story. Out of that damage, out of the enforced education of 2 world wars and the agricultural collapse that accompanied them, something genuinely useful was born. The crisis produced a reckoning that no amount of peacetime farming advice had ever managed. When the consequences of broken rotation and exhausted soil became impossible to ignore, farmers and the agricultural researchers working alongside them began to document what the old knowledge had always known but never written down. Crop rotation was not simply a tradition, it was a biological necessity. Here, in the ruined fields of the post-war years, was the proof. New potato varieties were developed with disease resistance built in. Plant breeders crossed cultivars with wild potato relatives, carrying natural resistance to blight and nematode damage. The work was slow and not always successful, but some of those varieties, or their direct descendants, are still in cultivation today. Composting practices were formalized and taught in ways they had never been before. Cover cropping, planting a field with legumes between potato seasons, not for harvest but purely to feed the soil, returned as a documented, promoted practice. Agricultural extension workers moved through rural Anatolian communities with new urgency, carrying the hard-won understanding that soil is not an infinite resource, and that treating it as one has consequences that outlast any generation. The war was a brutal teacher, but it taught. What the wartime farmer learned at enormous cost, you can apply in an afternoon. Start with rotation. It is the single most important lesson the potato wars left behind, and it remains the most commonly ignored practice in the home garden. Do not grow potatoes in the same bed 2 years running. The pathogen load that builds up in continuously cropped potato soil, the blight spores, the nematodes, the scab bacteria, does not disappear between seasons. It waits. It builds. Move your potatoes. Give the ground they occupied at least 2 seasons of something different before they return. Legumes are your best choice for those intervening years. Beans, peas, clover, because they will quietly fix the nitrogen your potato crop stripped out and leave the soil measurably better than they found it. Feed the soil before you ask it to feed you. The wartime collapse of soil organic matter taught this at enormous cost. A soil that is biologically alive, rich in earthworms, fungal networks, and the bacterial communities that cycle nutrients, will grow a healthier potato plant than any synthetic feed applied to dead ground. Compost your potato haulms after harvest, once you are certain they carry no blight. Return organic matter every season. The dark, crumbly, moisture-holding soil every gardener is working toward is not something you can buy in a bag. It is the result of years of returning more to the ground than you take out. Watch for blight with the eyes of someone who knows what it costs. The lesions begin on the leaves, dark, water-soaked patches with a pale halo at the edge, appearing first on the lower leaves and leaf tips. They spread fast in warm, humid weather. If you see them, act the same day. Remove the affected foliage immediately, do not compost it, and assess whether conditions favor the disease spreading through the whole planting. A healthy, well-rotated, organically fed potato bed will still get blight in a bad year, but it will get it later, handle it better, and recover more cleanly than a bed that has been working from depleted soil for too many seasons. Choose your varieties with intention. The plant breeders who worked in the post-war years to develop blight-resistant cultivars did not do that work so it could go unused. Sarpomira, Orla, Satanta, these are not exotic varieties. They are the direct descendants of the disease resistance programs that wartime devastation made urgent. If you garden in a climate with warm, wet summers, growing a resistant variety is the Anatolian farmer's lesson applied directly to your raised bed. Diversify. Grow potatoes. Love potatoes, but do not grow only potatoes. The farm that survived the wartime years with the least damage was never the one that had committed everything to a single crop. It was the one that still had something standing when the blight came through. Your garden does not need to feed you through a war, but it will feed you better year after year if it is built on the same logic that Anatolian farmers arrived at through hard experience. The ground rewards diversity and punishes dependence, every time, without exception. Come back to the beginning for a moment. A farmer, a field, the early morning light coming over the ridge the way it has come every morning for centuries, falling across soil that has grown wheat and olives and lentils and potatoes, and the quiet daily labor of people whose names history never thought worth recording. A pair of hands pressed into the earth before the day's work begins, reading it, feeling what it is carrying. That image has not changed. Not really. The potato is still there, in that conversation. Still one of the most extraordinary crops a human being can put into the ground. Everything the wartime farmer discovered about it, its resilience, its caloric generosity, its willingness to grow where other crops surrender, remains true. The potato saved lives on a scale that is genuinely difficult to comprehend when you are standing in front of a single raised bed on a quiet weekend morning. And the over-reliance on it damaged soil on a scale that took generations to repair. Both things are true at once. That is the whole lesson. The Anatolian farmer who lived through both world wars did not stop growing potatoes. Of course not. He grew them better. He grew them as part of something larger. He grew them the way you grow something when you know what it costs to lose it. That knowledge is yours now. Not because you lived through what he lived through. You did not, and that is genuinely something to be grateful for. but because the soil keeps records. And those records have been passed forward through every grower who ever noticed that the ground gives back what you put into it and charges interest on what you take without returning. Your garden is not separate from that history. It is continuous with it. The bed you turn over this spring, the seed potato you press in at the right depth at the right time, the compost you worked in last autumn, all of it connects back to something longer and deeper than a single growing season. Tend it well. If something in this story changed the way you think about what is happening beneath your feet, leave a comment below. Tell us what your soil is carrying this season. If you have not subscribed yet, this is the moment. We uncover stories like this one regularly, the history that lives beneath the surface of the everyday, right where the ground tells you things before the season does. We will see you in the next one.